When the German army invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, confidence was absolute. The Wehrmacht had conquered half of Europe in just 2 years, defeating armies twice its size and moving with precision that seemed almost mechanical. But deep within German command circles, there was an unspoken fear, not of the enemy's tactics, but of time, distance, and supply. Every kilometer east stretched the same question: can we keep this machine fed, fueled, and fighting? While German generals meticulously planned their offensives, they assumed the same rules would bind their enemies. They believed logistics were a limitation shared by all. What they didn't know was that across the Atlantic, a different kind of war was being fought. Not in trenches or skies, but on assembly lines and rail networks. In 1942, as Field Marshal Erwin Rommel pushed through North Africa, his panzer divisions were starving for fuel. Allied ships, protected by convoys and radar, were cutting off his supply lines. At the same time, in Detroit, a single American factory, Ford's Willow Run, was producing one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. German intelligence refused to believe it. Reports that the Americans were producing more tanks and planes in a month than Germany could in half a year were dismissed as propaganda. But captured German officers later admitted that when they finally saw the scale of American production, they realized the true nature of modern warfare had changed forever. To the Germans, war was about precision, efficiency, and discipline. To the Americans, it was about capacity, a tidal wave of machines, fuel, and food that no strategy could outmaneuver. By 1943, Allied logistics had become a weapon in itself. Convoys carrying millions of tons of supplies crossed the Atlantic each month, guarded by radar-equipped destroyers and air cover. Every crate of ammunition, every tank rolling off a ship in Normandy represented a silent victory in the war of logistics. German generals began to notice something terrifying. No matter how many ships they sank or factories they bombed, American supplies never stopped. It was as if the United States had tapped into an endless reservoir of steel and energy. After the war, General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the Wehrmacht, would write, "We did not lose the war because of tactics. We lost because we could not match the industrial power of America." To him, the defeat was not on the battlefield. It was on the railroad, the convoy route, and the factory floor. The shock came slowly. As German commanders were captured, interrogators showed them photos, rows of American trucks stretching for miles, Liberty ships packed with cargo, airfields filled with hundreds of aircraft waiting for fuel. The scale was unimaginable. One general reportedly said, "It's as if America itself was a factory, every town, every person, part of the same machine." That machine was logistics, the invisible weapon that Germany never fully understood until it was too late. The first real shock came not from bombs or tanks, but from what followed them. After every Allied offensive, the Germans noticed something strange. Within days, the enemy seemed to grow stronger, not weaker. New vehicles appeared, new soldiers arrived, and somehow they always had fuel. In North Africa, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had built his reputation on speed and precision. But by late 1942, he was running on fumes. His tanks, once symbols of dominance, sat silent in the sand. Supply convoys from Italy were being sunk faster than they could sail. Every drop of fuel was life or death. Rommel once wrote in his diary, "The bravest men cannot fight without petrol." On the other side of the desert, the Americans were learning the art of movement. Their convoys rolled forward like arteries of a living creature. Every jeep carried fuel cans, every truck had spare parts, and every forward post was connected by a chain of logistics that seemed endless. When Rommel's forces captured Allied positions, they often found stockpiles of supplies beyond imagination: food, ammunition, spare tires, cigarettes, even fresh uniforms. The Germans joked bitterly that the Americans fought their war from inside a warehouse, but beneath the laughter was fear. Because in every battle, they began to see that this new kind of war, the war of logistics, was one they could never win. By the time the Allies invaded Italy in 1943, the German High Command was already stretched thin. Trains carrying ammunition from the Ruhr to the front were bombed daily by Allied aircraft. Factories worked non-stop, but coal was scarce, and the rail network was collapsing. Meanwhile, the Americans were using a logistical miracle, the Liberty ship. These ships, mass-produced in weeks, carried tanks, fuel, and food across the Atlantic in a constant stream. Built from prefabricated parts, they represented everything Germany's war economy was not: fast, adaptable, and infinitely scalable. A single American shipyard could launch a new vessel faster than Germany could replace one sunk. Every time a U-boat scored a victory, 10 more ships appeared to fill the gap. Captured German officers would later admit their disbelief. One interrogated after the war said, "We thought we were sinking the Atlantic. Then we realized we were drowning in American steel." As the Allies advanced north, the rhythm of the American war machine became impossible to ignore. When the Fifth Army reached Naples, the harbor was in ruins. Within days, US engineers cleared debris, rebuilt docks, and unloaded hundreds of tons of supplies: food, medicine, ammunition, even ice cream machines for the troops. German intelligence reported this with a mix of amazement and frustration. The Americans turn rubble into ports faster than we can destroy them. To the Germans, who measured progress in kilometers gained, it was inconceivable that the Americans measured theirs in tons delivered. Every soldier fed, every engine fueled, every bullet fired was a logistical triumph. And behind every advance stood an invisible army of mechanics, drivers, engineers, and planners, men who fought with ledgers instead of rifles. By 1944, the German High Command understood that the battlefield was no longer just geography, it was infrastructure. The war was being won, not by generals, but by logistics officers who could move an army across oceans and keep it fighting for years without pause. When Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt inspected the defenses of Western Europe, he warned that they could not stop the coming Allied invasion. "The Americans," he said, "fight with mathematics. Every attack is calculated, every loss replaced." In the skies, American bombers struck German rail lines, fuel depots, and bridges. But the greatest weapon wasn't the bomb, it was what followed after. Within hours of a strike, repair crews, bulldozers, and trucks arrived to rebuild. The Americans didn't wait for stability, they created it. And yet, the true horror for the German command wasn't just the scale, it was the tempo. The pace at which America fought defied understanding. Where Germany's strength lay in precision, America's lay in motion. Factories didn't rest, ships didn't wait, trains didn't stop. It was as if an entire continent had become one living machine, one that never slept, never slowed, and never ran out of fuel. General Heinz Guderian, architect of Germany's Blitzkrieg, once boasted that speed was the essence of war. But by 1944, he was watching an enemy move faster than he ever imagined, not through brilliance, but through supply. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy, the writing was on the wall. Germany's armies still fought with courage and skill, but their world was collapsing behind them. The front lines were just the edge of a much larger system. A system powered by oil, steel, and coordination on a scale no European power had ever achieved. In that moment, the German generals began to understand. They were not just fighting soldiers, they were fighting industry itself. Before dawn, on June 6, 1944, the German coastal defenses of Normandy came alive. Reports flooded in, hundreds of ships, thousands of landing craft, paratroopers in the night sky. The Allies had come at last. For years, Hitler's generals had prepared for this moment, believing they could repel the invasion through sheer force. But as the sun rose that morning, what they saw through their binoculars didn't look like an army. It looked like a continent moving toward them. From the beaches of Omaha to the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, the sea itself seemed alive, filled with vessels of every shape and size. In total, nearly 7,000 ships crossed the English Channel that day. To the Germans, it was an impossible number. They had expected perhaps a few hundred. Instead, it was an armada that defied comprehension. General Erwin Rommel, who oversaw the Atlantic defenses, had warned that the Allies would bring not just soldiers, but an entire industrial network. "The first 24 hours of the invasion will decide the fate of Germany," he said. "If we cannot stop them at the water's edge, we will be defeated by their supply." He was right. As the battle raged, the Americans began doing something the Germans found unimaginable. They built new ports while fighting. Artificial harbors, known as mulberries, were assembled off the coast piece by piece to create docking points for ships where no harbors existed. Within days, convoys were unloading tanks, ammunition, and rations directly onto the beaches. To the German command, it looked like madness. To the Americans, it was just logistics. One captured German officer later recalled watching through binoculars as cranes, pontoons, and bulldozers appeared along the coastline. "We thought the invasion would collapse under its own weight," he said, "but they brought the weight with them." The German generals had been trained to fight battles of maneuver, of tanks and timing. They measured success in divisions destroyed and territory gained. But here, the Allies measured victory in tons delivered. By the end of D-Day, over 150,000 men had landed, and behind them came 20,000 vehicles and 100,000 tons of equipment. Every bullet, every can of fuel, every ration pack had a purpose. The Germans were stunned. The Wehrmacht's own supply lines were shrinking, their factories bombed, their trains running on borrowed time, and yet the Americans seemed to have endless reserves. Every explosion on the beach was answered by a new ship unloading replacements. Every destroyed tank was replaced by 2 more arriving the next morning. From Berlin, reports painted a grim picture. "The Allies' material resources appear limitless," one intelligence officer wrote. "Their soldiers are ordinary, but their machines are extraordinary." By July, that assessment was an understatement. The Americans built fuel pipelines under the English Channel, Operation Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean. Fuel now flowed directly from Britain to France, feeding trucks, tanks, and bombers. It was one of the most ambitious engineering feats of the war, and it made the difference between mobility and paralysis. German officers couldn't believe it. One captured colonel described it as a miracle of logistics, a machine that grows as it moves. When Allied forces pushed deeper into France, the scale only grew. Along every road, endless lines of trucks formed the famous Red Ball Express, a convoy system that delivered 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. Drivers worked around the clock, navigating mud, wreckage, and air raids. But the flow never stopped. To the Germans, who were rationing fuel and bullets, it was demoralizing. "We fought divisions," one general said, "but we were defeated by trucks." From the front lines, German soldiers wrote home about their astonishment. They described American supply dumps stretching for miles, warehouses of food, fuel, and spare parts built in days. To men who had grown up in scarcity, it felt surreal. How could a nation so far away fight a war with such abundance? Even Hitler himself began to suspect the truth. In a rare moment of doubt, he told his staff, "Our enemies are not stronger, only richer." But what he failed to understand was that America's wealth was not just financial. It was organizational. It was the ability to mobilize millions of people into a single synchronized effort. where a factory worker in Michigan and a mechanic in Normandy were part of the same fight. Captured generals, interrogated after D-Day, often struggled to describe what they had witnessed. "We thought the Americans were amateurs," one said. "Now we see they were engineers of war itself." By the autumn of 1944, Germany's logistical collapse was complete. Fuel shortages grounded entire Luftwaffe squadrons. Trains stopped. Panzer divisions that once raced across Europe now stood still, their tanks abandoned for lack of gasoline. Meanwhile, the American army was moving faster than ever, not because they fought better, but because they never ran out of anything. The war had become a race between nations' ability to sustain motion, and Germany, for all its discipline, could not outrun the machine that never slept. By the winter of 1944, the German war machine was running on empty. Entire divisions were fighting without fuel, horses once again replaced trucks, and soldiers marched barefoot through snow that froze the oil in their rifles. Yet in the West, the American army was accelerating. From the beaches of Normandy to the forests of Belgium, they advanced with a precision that seemed mechanical. Every offensive was backed by columns of trucks, trains, and ships moving in perfect rhythm. Fuel convoys, field kitchens, repair depots, and medical units, all operating like parts of a single, enormous engine. For the German generals, the shock was unbearable. They had built their armies around the idea of efficiency, that with discipline and planning, a smaller force could defeat a larger one. But now that belief was collapsing under the weight of reality. Captured reports described American soldiers eating warm meals on the front lines, receiving mail from home within days, and fighting with a constant stream of replacements. It wasn't just about resources, it was about organization. When General Günther Blumentritt was taken prisoner, he reportedly stared for hours at a U.S. supply convoy passing through France. Thousands of trucks moving without pause. He said quietly to his captors, "Now I understand how we lost." It wasn't the tanks or the bombers. It was the idea that a nation could turn its entire society into an army of movement. Farmers, factory workers, engineers, drivers, and clerks, each one connected to the next by a chain of purpose. In American prisoner camps, the revelation deepened. The Germans had expected revenge, humiliation, or hunger. Instead, they found order and abundance. They were fed well, treated with consistency, and given work. And as they watched the endless trains of supplies rolling past the fences, the question grew louder. How did they do it? For many, it was their first true look at the enemy's system. They saw that even in captivity, the Americans ran everything with the same precision as in war. Schedules, inventory, supply, routine. One general described it in his diary, "They fight with logistics and they live with logistics. It is not a department. It is their culture." Inside one camp, a captured logistics officer from the Wehrmacht drew comparisons in a notebook later found after the war. He wrote just one word beneath it, unthinkable. Interrogators from the U.S. Army began showing films and photographs to captured generals. They were shown footage of American shipyards with Liberty ships sliding into the water one after another. They saw footage of assembly lines where women worked alongside men, producing engines, ammunition, and uniforms around the clock. The reactions were often silent. One general reportedly removed his cap and stared at the screen for a long time before saying, "We could never have won, not against this." To the German High Command, logistics had always been a servant to strategy, an afterthought, a necessary burden. To America, it was the strategy itself. After the war, Allied interrogators compiled thousands of testimonies. Again and again, one theme emerged: the disbelief of German officers at how deeply logistics was woven into every aspect of the American war effort. They called it the invisible weapon, not because it was secret, but because it was everywhere. From the oil fields of Texas to the railways of New Jersey, from the factories of Detroit to the ports of Liverpool, it was a weapon made not of steel, but of organization, and it terrified them, because they realized that even if the war had continued for years, the outcome would not have changed. The American machine would have kept moving, producing and supplying, while theirs slowly ground to a halt. General Wilhelm Keitel, one of Hitler's closest military advisors, summarized it bluntly during his post-war interrogation. "We were outmaneuvered not by tactics, but by industry. We fought with courage, but they fought with momentum." The words carried a quiet tragedy, because for men who had lived their entire lives believing in the supremacy of will and discipline, it was unbearable to accept that their defeat came not from lack of bravery, but from lack of fuel. In their minds, war had always been about battlefields and heroism. But in the 20th century, they discovered it was about engines, trains, and ships. As one captured general wrote years later, "We never lost a battle we should have won. We simply ran out of the means to fight." For the German officer corps, that realization was the final wound, invisible but permanent. The war had ended not just in defeat, but in revelation. They hadn't been outsmarted. They had been outsupplied. The war in Europe ended not with a final battle, but with silence. By May of 1945, Germany's armies had vanished into ruins. Cities were ashes, trains stood still, fuel drums were empty, and along every road from Berlin to the Rhine, convoys of American trucks rolled past in a rhythm that felt eternal. Inside makeshift headquarters and prisoner camps, the remaining German generals tried to explain the unexplainable. How could a nation that had once conquered Europe fall so completely? How had their tactics, their precision, their discipline, everything they had believed in, failed against an enemy they had called untested and naive? They looked for answers in strategy, in weather, in luck, but none of it fit. The truth was simpler and far more humbling. They had been defeated by a kind of power they had never learned to understand: logistics. When interrogators asked them what moment they realized the war was lost, most did not name Stalingrad or Normandy or the Ardennes. They named moments of exhaustion, moments when fuel never arrived, when tanks stood silent, when soldiers starved as American jeeps passed them by, headlights glowing in the distance. That was when they understood that no amount of courage or strategy could stop an army that never ran out of motion. For the United States, this had been the true front line of the war, a battle fought not just by soldiers, but by welders, farmers, machinists, truck drivers, engineers, and clerks. Every bolt turned, every train loaded, every ship launched was a bullet fired in a different kind of battle, the war of endurance. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh had run 24 hours a day. Women built aircraft engines by the millions. Men too old to fight forged tank armor and naval guns. In the skies, American bombers flew missions made possible by rail networks that stretched from the Midwest to the Channel. And across the Atlantic, an invisible chain kept it all alive. Convoys, cranes, depots, pipelines, and the endless hum of motion. It was a war fought by momentum itself. The Germans had studied Napoleon, Clausewitz, and Schlieffen, but America had studied Henry Ford. To them, efficiency was not just theory, it was habit. The assembly line became the backbone of warfare. It produced not just weapons, but predictability. And predictability in war is power. Even as the Reich collapsed, the Americans built faster. They supplied their allies, fed entire nations, and prepared for the next front before the current one was even over. When German officers saw footage of this after the war, many sat in silence. One finally said, "We were still fighting a European war. They were fighting an industrial one." And that, in the end, was the difference. The United States had discovered a new kind of dominance, one that did not depend on territory or fear, but on systems, ships that could replace themselves. Factories that could double production overnight, a culture where every citizen believed that efficiency was a form of patriotism. It was the invisible weapon, and it had won the century. After 1945, the lesson spread far beyond the ruins of Europe. Every modern army studied the American model, the seamless integration of economy, industry, and war. The Cold War that followed would not just be about ideology, but about supply. Tanks, missiles, and nuclear silos all depended on the same ancient truth. Power belongs to those who can move it. The German generals who survived often spoke of their defeat with a kind of respect, some even admiration, because they understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented, the birth of a new era of warfare, an age where the winners would not be the bravest or even the smartest, but the most organized. As the years passed, the photographs of those endless convoys, those floating ports, those roaring factories became symbols of more than victory. They became a reminder that in the modern world, greatness is not forged in battle, but built in infrastructure. America's greatest weapon was never the bomb or the tank or the plane. It was the ability to connect every part of itself into one unstoppable machine. And when that machine began to move, the world changed forever. Even today, decades after the war, the echoes of that machine remain. Every highway, every cargo ship, every global supply chain traces its roots back to that invisible network that won World War II. The German generals had called it the endless system. History calls it something else. The moment the world learned what logistics could do,